and welcome everybody. Thank you for coming out for today's discussion of migration, state violence, and global displacement. My name is Justin Lang, and I'm a member of the Black Alliance for Peace Haiti Americas team, as well as a member of BAT member organization, the Black Socialist Formation in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I'm really excited to be a part of this conversation today, featuring Katia Bante, Abraham Palos, Genevieve Williams-Comrie, and Netfa Freeman. And we'll share each bio before they talk. So I thought I'd just open returning to the BAP vision and sharing the mission of the Haiti Americas team for those who might not be familiar. The Black Alliance for Peace seeks to recapture and redevelop the historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions of the radical Black movement through educational activities, organizing and movement support. Organizations and individuals in the Alliance work to oppose both militarized domestic state repression and the policies of destabilization, subversion, and the permanent war agenda of the U.S. state globally. And we'll break that out more today. We'll see how that plays out. And today's discussion is a part of the Haiti Americas team work to carry out this vision with our focus on achieving the liberation of all peoples in the region informed by the necessity of class struggle. We advocate from within the empire in support of anti-imperialist movements. So key to the work of the Haiti Americas team is to grow awareness both within and outside of the African Black diaspora that the crisis of Haiti, of the Americas, is a crisis of U.S. imperialism. And the U.S. has for well over a century manufactured instability in the region to validate direct U.S. military invasion or the invasion of neo-colonial proxies. The team has created a lot of material, and particularly I want to shout out the work of Dr. Jemima Pierre as a place to go for granular detail on this. And there's been a lot of prior teachings that you can see that will support today's discussion, whether it's the U.S. Marines, the Organization of American States, the core group, a lot of pieces that you'll see that connect to what you'll hear today. And the record's quite long. So in that vein, today's really insightful and experienced panelists will lead us in a conversation to help us further understand the violence that is apparently just us doing it to ourselves, whether in Haiti or in U.S. neighborhoods here, but it's actually all U.S. state sponsored. And to do this through the lens of examining the complexities of migration, state violence, and global displacement. So without further delay, we're going to kick it over to Abraham Palos. Abraham Palos has an extensive experience advocating for policies on racial justice and equity, criminal legal system abuses, and immigrants' rights in the United States. Abraham is currently the Deputy Director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. Give it to you, Abraham.
Thank you so much, Justin. Really appreciate that. So like Justin said, my name is Abraham Palos. I am the Deputy Director of the Black Alliance for Just Immigration. I've been sort of thrown into this work through a situation that happened to me a little while ago, and that was sort of getting picked up in Brooklyn for a crime, robbery that had happened, and I ended up in Rikers Island. And it was at Rikers where there was a trailer, an ICE trailer on the island, right? And it was where I had learned that ICE officers were able to come into Rikers and pick non-citizens up. And since then, for the last 15 years, I've been working, sort of speaking out against deportations, detention, and criminalization. So today, what I hope to do is give folks kind of a bit of a background around citizenship in this country, right? To talk a little bit about the laws, because I think that they're very important to understand sort of the structure that we are in today, okay? And then hopefully I'll end with a couple of thoughts, right? And a couple of analysis, particularly what's happening with Haiti and our the Haitian community that is here in the United States. And usually I want to just kind of give a historical reference and historical context, particularly around this idea of citizenship, right? Which has been very tumultuous in this country. The first Citizenship Act was 1791, and basically what it said was that white male property owners could be a citizen, right? And that excluded a lot of people. It excluded the indigenous community that was here. It excluded Black people, right, that were enslaved at the time, obviously women. And I bring that up because when we look at the prison population today, what we see is that the disproportionate community that is locked up are Black and Indigenous folks. And that is not a coincidence, right? So that is baked in to the idea of what a citizen is in this country and how state violence reacts to those that have been excluded, right? And I think that to focus a little bit on Black people for a hot second, particularly when people are thinking about immigration, Black people in this country have always challenged white supremacy. And in that challenge of white supremacy has always been more inclusive in the wins and the gains that they get. The 14th Amendment is a great example of that, right? When Black people sort of quote unquote became citizens, right, there was a big issue about what to do with the generations that were to come. And that's where we got the 14th Amendment, basically saying that if you're born in the United States, right, you are automatically a citizen. This is a central right that is now being attacked, right, by MAGA and the Trump administration in the Supreme Court. And that 14th Amendment is very important because what it sort of did is that it opened up this country to immigration. And all the way up until, I would probably say, the 1960s, right? Immigration into this country basically meant that white people from Europe had an open door policy for, and a red carpet to a certain extent compared to what's been happening now. And in the 1960s, Black people, again, challenging white supremacy via the civil rights movement, Black Panthers, and what have you. It also gave us the Immigration Act of 1965, not to mention the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act. But in 1965, another immigration legislation was passed that opened up immigration for Black and brown people that were coming from Africa, Asia, and South America. So much so that by the 1980s, 86% of people coming into this country as immigrants, right, were Black and brown people. Now we have an immigration problem, right? According to the powers that be and according to the white supremacist structure, we have a huge problem. In the 1980s and in the 1990s, right, there were social issues happening mostly in urban Black and brown America, right? And so at that point, you start to see Congress get together and essentially declare war. And we know this as the war on drugs. We know this as the war on crime with the 1993 crime bill. We know it as the war on poverty, right, with the legislations that came during that point, right? But we also know it through a little known law that came out in 1996. This is a very long name, right, for my translators out there. It is the Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act, IRA, right? And what IRA did, again, it came out of the 1990s, it did a couple of things. One, it expanded crimes that one can be deported for, right? There were a handful of categories, but this law expanded it to more than, I think some people count 50 categories. It also used language called mandatory detention and mandatory deportation. They cut and paste that language out of the 1993 crime bill. You guys might know it as mandatory sentencing, right? And so what we have in this legislation, it's the last time that Congress had passed an immigration law, and this is still the law of the land, is the 1996 laws. There hasn't been many new laws that have came out. And what this does is that it gives us the structure for detention and deportation that we see now, okay? And that's essentially sort of the context that I really want to let people know, right? How does Haiti play a part in this? Well, obviously, since 1801, right, Haiti, it has essentially what I call like unforgivable blackness. What they had done to the French army, what they had done to colonization, the US was essentially extremely, extremely afraid of Haitians and their ability, right, for rebellion and their ability for revolution. And we see this in the 1990s, right? The first use of Guantanamo Bay were for Haitian immigrants. They had said that they, quote unquote, had issues with HIV or AIDS or whatever have you. But that lockdown, right, that happened was really meant for Haitians. And we still sort of see this disdain, right, for Haitian immigrants, and a lot of the anti-blackness in immigration legislation is really focused around Haiti. A great example is that during the first Trump administration in 2017, uh, temporary protected status for Haitians, right? Essentially, before it was renewed for an extension on that right to be here in the country, the Trump administration ran criminal record background checks. It was unprecedented. It had never happened before. And in fact, it was quite laughable because to get temporary protected status, you could not have had any contact with the criminal system. But what we see in this country time and time again, right, is that criminalization becomes the justification for state violence. And the 1996 laws did that exactly. What it did was that it would adjudicate a law, right, made it so that folks that were essentially undeportable, non-deportable, became deportable through the retroactivity of the law, right? And there was an enforcement. And that enforcement is what we, INS, Immigration Naturalization Services at the time, and now they're more enforcement, right? And that enforcement is the apparatus that we see to this day. It came out of another war, right? That war was the war on terror, right? And so what we see here is a pattern. We see the pattern of the US government essentially declaring war on Black and Brown people on their own lands, right? And using criminalization as the best tool, right? So that folks can get locked up in prison, right? And so that folks can then get excluded and deported out of this country. And today, what we see is a situation, right, where we have uh, empty, well, right before the Trump administration, we had empty prisons and cold weapons, and there was no actual war. The Trump administration has essentially declared war on non-citizens, right? So that they can fill in those prisons so that those weapons can start to be used again. And we see that, right? 40,000 non-citizens are locked up, not to mention the citizens that are going through mass incarceration also, right? We also see that immigration customs enforcement, right, becoming sort of a Gestapo in this country, right? And not just ICE. We're also looking at the ATF, alcohol, tobacco, and firearms. 80% of ATF is now doing immigration work, right? The Drug Enforcement Administration, DEA, 1 in 4 DEA agents are doing immigration work, right? And so what we start to see is the culmination and the manifestation, and essentially what I like to call the resistance, right? To the gains that Black people have done in this country, to the gains that all different vulnerable, marginalized communities have done in this country. And that resistance is via state violence, via ICE agents, ATF, DEA, and the filling of these prisons. And once these prisons get to a max, they then will export that state violence to places like El Salvador, right, which is now essentially going to become a penal colony, to places like Panama and to places like Costa Rica. And so what we've seen right here is that the biggest export that the US is actually now about to start to do is their state violence in a way that reflects and is emblematic, right, through prisons. I'll stop there, and maybe other folks have questions. You should probably have a lot of questions. I didn't cover too much, but I wanted to just sort of, end on that note, and end on the note, bringing it back to Haiti and the immigration enforcement that has always been wrapped, right, around ideas of liberation, right, around the idea, particularly around Black liberation, right, and liberation of vulnerable communities, and how this administration is going to do everything to resist our liberation movement. And I'll end there. Thank you again.
Great. Well, actually, I think we're going to questions at the end. So if you have anything else you want to share, Abraham, you're welcome to. If not, we'll go and transition over to Katia Bonte. That's good. You want to try? Okay, bet. So I think that sets us up really well. The statement that Haiti had unforgivable Blackness. And so we're going to hear from Katia Bonte, who's a coordinator.
Bonjour à tout le monde. Moi, c'est Katia Bonte,
Here we
coordonnatrice
go.
du GOV.
No introduction
Je
needed.
suis très content de prendre le gouvernement dominicain et surtout contre les migrants haïtiens. Donc, il y a vraiment une psychose de peur qui... Ça va, je peux continuer? Oui. Donc, les migrants haïtiens en République dominicaine on évolue actuellement dans un contexte de grande peur. Il y a même des menaces directes sur leur vie par rapport à certains groupes dominicains donc, qui ont prévu de faire un massacre sur les Haïtiens en République dominicaine. Donc, il y avait une tentative de manifestation donc, contre ces gens. Donc, heureusement, il y a aujourd'hui, fait 15 jours, heureusement que l'État dominicain, quelque part, avait pris quelques décisions pour empêcher ce massacre. Et là, ces mesures-là, donc on est en train, nous autres cas, de les analyser et pour voir juridiquement est-ce que ces mesures-là ne vont pas entraîner des situations néfastes et encore plus néfastes contre ces migrants haïtiens. Et du côté de la frontière, donc c'est vraiment terrible parce que actuellement les migrants il y a toujours le processus de rapatriement continu et on peut dire massivement. On peut dire massivement parce que les gens viennent constamment sur la frontière. Et malheureusement, en Haïti, donc, il y a les avancées des gangs et du côté de Mirbalais qui empêchent ces migrants-là de retourner dans leur lieu d'origine en Haïti. Donc là, il y a vraiment une très grande préoccupation parce que ils ne peuvent pas, les gens qui sont rapatriés du côté du nord-est ne peuvent pas traverser pour arriver jusqu'à Port-au-Prince et pour se rendre dans les autres départements comme la Tibonite et Grand'Anse, Nip, le sud et le sud-est. Donc là, ils sont en condition très, disons, très minable et bon, je ne vois pas comment décrire ces conditions-là. Donc, il y a les gens qui arrivent du côté de Belader parce que Belader est à proximité de Mirbalais et les gangs et les armées ont déjà envahi Mirbalais, ce qui empêche ces personnes rapatriées de et d'aller vers d'autres lieux et bon, leur lieu d'origine. Donc là, il y a un grand problème sur la frontière et mis à part, il y a personnes déplacées, OK, qui les déplacés de Mirbalais vont soit à Ain, soit à Belader. Donc, il y a tout un ensemble de personnes déplacées et rapatriées qui vivent sur la frontière et, et ça, la situation est vraiment très compliquée parce que il y a d'autres choses encore. Et à cause de l'inaccessibilité de ces routes-là, donc il y a des produits qui ne peuvent pas arriver. Par exemple, nos autres regards, nous avons un centre d'hébergement pour recevoir les personnes rapatriées du côté du centre, mais on ne peut pas faire arriver des produits jusqu'au centre, des produits alimentaires, des produits hygiéniques. Et là, nous sommes en train de réfléchir et pour voir s'il y a une alternative. Donc, on ne voit pas encore cette alternative. Donc, on ne peut pas acheter en République dominicaine parce que la frontière est fermée. Donc, et on ne donne pas de visa. Donc, on ne peut pas traverser pour aller acheter en République dominicaine. Et on ne peut pas traverser avec des produits et que pour arriver jusqu'au centre, là où on reçoit ces rapatriés. Et bon, là, la situation commence à être compliquée et parce que si on n'arrive pas à approvisionner le centre pour donner à manger et donner des kits hygiéniques à ces rapatriés, bon, je ne sais pas que ce serait la catastrophe, mais c'est vraiment une situation qui nous préoccupe actuellement. Donc, je fais un pas encore en République dominicaine pour voir, il y a une autre situation qui se développe, c'est par rapport avec des descendants et des Dominicains descendants d'Haïti. Là, et ces gens-là ont vraiment de graves problèmes parce qu'on est en train de digitaliser les données sur les identités de ces personnes. Donc, toutes les personnes qui ont un nom rapproché d'Haïti, c'est-à-dire si la personne s'appelle Jean, Pierre et Auguste, un nom français ou bien un nom créole. Donc, ils sont retirés catégoriquement du système. Et on ne veut pas enregistrer ces gens-là dans le système électronique, le système d'identité. Donc, cela veut dire que cette situation va augmenter encore plus le nombre d'apatrides. Donc, parce que ils ne veulent pas reconnaître les Dominicains descendants haïtiens à cause de leur nom. Donc, ils ne veulent pas enregistrer ces personnes-là sur leur système. Donc, et on sait très bien la situation d'apatridie a de graves conséquences sur la vie d'une personne ou d'un enfant quelconque parce que cette personne-là ne peut pas aller à l'école, ne peut pas trouver de travail. Donc, c'est une personne qui existe, mais qui ne vit pas normalement. Donc, ce sont de graves situations qui évoluent actuellement là en République dominicaine. Donc, qui demandent vraiment d'être bien analysé et pour qu'on puisse faire de grands plaidoyers pour ces gens. Donc, non seulement pour les migrants qui vivent en République dominicaine. Donc, ils sont partis et pour la plupart, à cause de l'insécurité. Donc, et là, donc, on est en train de les renvoyer constamment et en Haïti dans n'importe quelle condition. Et donc, ça, ça demande beaucoup de réflexion et ça demande également un travail en synergie pour voir comment faire un plaidoyer pour la protection de ces personnes. Donc, c'est ça un peu la situation en République dominicaine et sur la frontière et actuellement. Donc, je serai là pour suivre et s'il y a des questions, donc je pourrai répondre. Merci.
Thank you, Katia.
Oui.
I wish I would say this in French, but we'll come to questions at the end. So we're going to actually go now to hear from Geneviève Williams-Comrie, who is the founder and the current executive director of Afro Resistance. Afro Resistance is committed to educating and organizing for human rights, democracy, and racial justice throughout the Americas. Geneviève is a human rights strategist, trainer, and organizer with a deep commitment to assist in the building of powerful movements for racial justice and human rights. So I'll kick it to you, Geneviève.
All right, thank you and welcome everybody. Thanks again to Black Alliance for Peace for organizing this. And as I was tasked today, I'm going to try my best to map the connections between migration, state violence, the prison imperialism, and militarization, which are all not new issues. I feel a lot of times within the United States, people are waking up now, and now they're thinking that these issues are brand new and like they haven't been here for centuries, right? And the first thing for me is that I personally, like other folks, all the speakers here, I believe, have been impacted by these policies, by these systems, which are in essence state violence, and that that's one of my starting points, right? That I have been directly impacted by these things as well. I'm also going to give the disclaimer that I do have two small children that might interrupt. Hopefully they won't. So, these forces that I spoke about, migration, state violence, prison imperialism, militarization, are not separate forces. They're part of a machinery of global control. They're also rooted in empire. They're anti-Black. And they thrive because of the continual exploitation of the global South, right? So if we really want liberation, we have to understand the full architecture of our oppression. And the entry points are many, but the thing is, we have to fight at every single point. I've been in person, always part of organizations that do not divide the issues. And at times, that gets tense and combative for a lot of other folks. So for me, I'm bringing again that my entry point is every single entry, right? At every single point of what I spoke about. So I'm going to focus this first part of migration, state violence, and U.S. exceptionalism. First thing is that migration is not a new phenomenon. It's not even a phenomenon anymore. It's an engineered action and is a direct product of US foreign policy and European exploitation, right? So that includes sanctions, war, economic exploitation, and now militarization under the banner of security, right? So now we are seeing a transfer of language, right? So now the big thing is security. As an organization, we have always tackled U.S. foreign policy in the region. And in the region for us is the Americas, so including all of Latin America and the Caribbean, and we always focus on the impact that these things have on Black women and girls specifically, right? So, we are seeing, and I'm going to focus a lot of what I'm going to talk about around Panama, because Panama has always been, Panama and Colombia have always been models of testing our US foreign policy. And because it's primarily Black people living in these communities, it usually goes under the cover in international news, even in local news, right? To be honest, in those two countries. But international news and in the United States, it's not something that a lot of people know about, right? So Panama, in essence, has had a dangerous shift towards militarization, which is basically a case study of how US exceptionalism justifies violence across the hemisphere, right? So right now, as it is this past week, in Panama, US Marines have been conducting goodwill concerts, right? And those goodwill concerts have been sponsored by the Panamanian government with United States, and that is a tactic to deepen military influence under the guise of training and security assistance, and in the meantime, to desensitize people from a military presence in a country whose article, and I actually want to read the article 310 of the Panamanian Constitution states that the Republic of Panama shall not have an army, right? So what's happening there is completely illegal, right? And at the same time, the US funds Panama to increase its harsh military control, especially against Black migrants. And now this has not been new, because Panama has been known within Panama to help and aid the deportation of Haitian people, right? So years ago, 2004, 2005, Panama was known to not allow Haitian immigrants to come in, which was basically orders from the United States when there was a coup d'etat happening in Haiti. Right? Panama sovereignty is being eroded right now. US intervention, historically resisted to denounce across Latin America, is now being normalized, right? And is disguised as cooperation. What we're witnessing is a recolonization project using the language of development, of security, of human aid, of defending the Panama Canal, right? And this, when we think about these things, this is the face of modern imperialism, right? It's less visible boots on the ground. It's more quiet. It's done behind doors. Now we have social media, which means that people can interact differently, especially those elected. And then there's the permanent occupation through economic pressure, right? There's also the militarized migration policy, which now it covers the whole region. And with that has to come, of course, police training from the United States, because now if people are migrating more throughout the region, now they need more and more of these agreements, parallel agreements between the different cities, and not only the countries, but different cities. So now you have, yes, United States, but you have the NYPD, you have the police in Atlanta going into different communities in our countries. So now this is also very focused, right? US exceptionalism also provides an ideological cover, right? Exceptionalism justifies sanctions, right? Based on myths and based on, fake news and information. So it justifies sanctions on Venezuela, on Cuba, and Haiti. For example, it accuses countries in taking place in medical trafficking. And then it forces people to do the research to prove. So we're also dealing with, like, interpersonally, this is narcissism behavior, right? So that's what's happening at a governmental level as well. US exceptionalism justifies different wars and invasions and occupations, as we're seeing now in countries like Panama and Colombia, in Brazil, Guatemala, and El Salvador. It justifies the installation of military bases, and it deters sovereign nations. So now people are questioning sovereignty, but every single time it's shifted, and then it shifts a little bit, and then it shifts a little bit, right? So then people start questioning, am I pro this or pro that? And that's what US exceptionalism does. It's a mechanism, right? And then it tells us what the United States does, no matter how violent. It tells us that the United States works for the greater good. And it erases the realities on the ground, right? So the framing that we're also, like, within upper resistance, that we're always fighting against, is this whole concept of migrant children are dying in the jungles of Darien. Why? Right? But that's not examined. What's being examined is that we have to protect the children. We have to protect the women, but we're not dealing with the core issues of why people are migrating, right? Families are separated on the border. And that's another one. There hundreds of thousands of children that are migrating on their own or with strangers, right? So the United States is looking for the solutions for the problems that it basically created, and then putting its focus on doing the good, on bringing families together again, on protecting children. But it's all lies, right? And that sovereign nations are doing better, right? Sovereign nations are doing better with the support from the empire, right? So, for example, how this manifests in the same country that resisted US occupation for years is now being pushed to welcome it back, but it's under a different name. So now it's under protection. Now it's to defend and to go against the Chinese that supposedly are running the canal, no matter how much there's proof that the Chinese are not running the canal, right? Now, I'll always argue that these developments raise urgent questions also about the positions of the elected officials, right? Because most of these countries, folks, right, and I'm speaking like Panama specifically, folks were thinking that they were allies of the empire, and folks were working with the empire, specifically about Panama, not all countries, but many, right? And now what's happening is that the same empire that they were really trying to get embedded with is now working against them. And instead of taking a stand, what we call forced nationalism, instead of doing that, they keep on selling and agreeing and negotiating. But at the end of the day, the empire is getting what it wants from the governments, but not from the people. People are resisting, right? Now, in regards to crossing border, right? Crossing borders transforms this entire conversation, right? So we're also witnessing prison imperialism. Basically, the global export from the United States model of racialized incarceration is now expanding more and more, and that's stuff that we have been fighting for decades, right? And an example is Guantanamo Bay, right? That's a core example, but also Panama's migrant camps, right? They replicate the lawlessness. Around a month and a half ago, we saw visibly that people were deported from the United States unwillingly and taken into Panama. Within 2 days, all those migrants, including families with children, were held at an undisclosed detention center. People still don't know exactly where that detention center was. So we do know that there were dire conditions with little oversight. They were facing extortion. There was a lot of abuse, and there was neglect. And then you also, the prison imperialism goes also to what we know really well now, El Salvador, right? They have expanded the prison, and now other countries are thinking it's a good idea. So this, and we have proof that this doesn't protect society. It criminalizes local people, and then it's criminalizing migration now, right? And it's very anti-Black. So detention centers, whether in Panama, El Salvador, or Texas, are weapons of war. We have to have that really clear. And you know, I got the warning of 2 minutes. Again, these struggles, these issues are not isolated. They're connected. They're globalized. They're also very intentional, and they're designed. And that's something that we have to keep very clear. And when I start doing strategy, I'm always thinking, wow, these people have designed this, and there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end, but there's a track, right? They're not just inventing things. These are things that have been designed for many years, and now we're seeing them executed back to back to back to back, right? But so are we. Right? I feel that we are connected, we're global, we're also resisting, we're also designing, we're also visualizing what our future could look like without the empire. So the more of us here, you know, the better, because now we get to really come together and redesign and design and try out and test out. And I think that's what this time requires. So I'll pause there.
Thanks so much, Genevieve. So we're going to then now close with Netfa Freeman. Netfa Freeman is, excuse me 1 second here. Sorry, thanks. He's an organizer in PACA, Pan-African Community Action, and on the coordinating committee of the Black Alliance for Peace. He was a member of the International Committee for Peace and Justice and Dignity. That was initially the International Committee for the Freedom of the Cuban Five until their release in 2014, and has been intimately involved with the Cuban Solidarity Movement for over 30 years. And Netfa's going to help us bring it down to the conditions here in the internal colony and kick it to you, Netfa.
Thank you. So yeah, all of these, the other presentations were very informative. I'm very honored to be on the panel. I just want to get right into it. One thing is I feel compelled to say something my friend Jean-Vier said, is the other panelists are directly impacted by this. I might say that I'm indirectly impacted on all those of us who preside in the bowels of the settler colonial state, in a sense where particularly when we talk about Cuba, a revolutionary country that has so much to offer the world, but in fact denied what they have to offer, is definitely denied to the citizens, or the people rather, I should say, that reside in the United States because of the blockade. First, I think that as a European supremacist settler state, the form immigration policy takes in the U.S. depends on how it can be weaponized. And so for example, where the policy might take one form in another place, like deportations and things like that. And when it comes to in Cuba, it's embracing immigrants. And it must be understood that illegal immigration, or should I say, I don't even know, or unsafe, I guess, illegal immigration has been, that's an appropriate word, because it's actually illegal or against the laws on both sides of the borders there, the country or the island of Cuba, and even in the United States. But illegal immigration from Cuba to the United States has always been encouraged by the United States. It's always been encouraged, and departures and unsafe departures and whatnot through manipulation of policies where they would inhibit the processing of visas and legal immigration, but put out propaganda and also welcome unsafe things on rafts and boats and things like that. The Cuban Revolution, contrary to the propaganda that the U.S. will put, has never prevented legal departures from the country. So you get this image, they've always promoted this images of Cuba this evil place that people would even risk their lives to get on rafts, unsafe rafts and whatnot, and come. But then how all of this is exacerbated and instigated is unknown, because people just don't know how immigration policy works or anything like that. We can go. I'm just going to kind of bullet point some key points. I want to, while I might say more about Cuba because it's a very interesting concept, but get in some either at the end. Key points are in the history, I guess, of U.S. or Cuban immigration to United States and how that's been handled. People may have heard of the infamous Peter Pan operations, Cuba, where the terror plot was, they were trying to say that the revolutionary government of Cuba was going to steal people's children from them and take away their parental rights. Some really absurd and very draconian propaganda things. So they induced a fear, a terror among people, so that they actually sent their children unaccompanied to the United States, and that they had these flights that took their children to the United States, and a lot of those people were separated. Those children were separated from their families, and never to meet them again. And then of course a lot of families regretted this happening. It's reminiscent of how in this settler state the so-called child protective services works, where they take children from parents, and particularly disproportionately African people in the United States. There's a organization I want to lift up, African National Women's Organization, ANWO, where they have a campaign and they charge the so-called child protective services with genocide and kidnapping of African children. And it's really what it is when we go into the really horrifying cases of how children have been separated from their parents, mostly the mothers, but just in general. But it's reminiscent of that thing, and we can see how these things are weaponized, and they're actually they're terrorism, and violence in terms of their impact. Now back to Cuba, and these are some what you call notable points in history. The Mariel boat rides in 1980, where the Cuban government announced that in working out this agreement with the Reagan administration, they announced that all the Cubans wishing to immigrate to the United States were free to board the boats that were at the port of Mariel in West Havana, and that launched the Mariel boat lifts. Of course, there was a lot of propaganda around this. People might even remember that it was this Mariel boat lift that was part of the I guess the beginnings of the premise of that movie, what you call Scarface, the Scarface. So in that Mariel boat rides, 125,000 Cuban refugees came to Florida, and that was like the next day after it was announced. Now these things are exacerbated because of the propaganda and also the economic conditions that the country has to face. One, because of the blockade, and also with the U.S. blockade that makes economic conditions hard, the sanctions, but also the fact that it's a country that by then the revolution was only 20 years old, and they were really still trying to come out of the mire of a neo-colonial situation, and where there was serious exploitation and those kind of things, and poverty and whatnot. So there were things and that exacerbated this issue. Now, when the Mariel boat rides, which you don't really get that that Scarface and those kind of movies and propaganda, let us know that there were concentration camps that were formed in Miami to receive immigrants. This because, unlike the other immigration that was taking place, where the elites of Cuba were escaping the revolution and come to the United States, the Mariel included, I guess, what would be considered the undesirable class elements of the United States. So they were welcomed and put into concentration camps, and it was so many of them. So that's one of the things that is notable about the Mariel boat rides. I should go back some and talk in 1966, and this is the exceptional situation that the United States has with Cuba, unlike a lot of other countries. In the 1966 was the Cuban Adjustment Act. A lot of people might know it as the wet foot, dry foot act or policy. And that said that any Cubans who was able to reach the United States would be able to be apply for Cuban citizenship in a year, and they would be under. And so this is contrasted against any other policy. And then also people are not, and it's meant to almost have a propaganda effect, not almost, but to have a propaganda effect. This evil country that needs to be overthrown, people are trying to escape it because it's so horrific. But nothing is told about the blockade. We call it a blockade, the crushing sanctions. We call it a blockade. A lot of people say the embargo, but that's only referring to one aspect of the U.S. policy against Cuba that has to be factored into everything that we look at when we look at Cuba, particularly trying to understand the what the United States professes against the United States government and whatnot. So we refer to it as a blockade because it's a multifaceted and protracted war. It doesn't just include the economic sanctions and the embargo, but it also includes the terrorism, that they've orchestrated with CIA trained Cuban exiles often from the shores of Miami, blowing up hotels and airplanes and things like that. Propaganda campaign, bombarding Radio Marti and other broadcasts, and flying and dropping leaflets and invading Cuban airspace. All of these things, and that also includes not just the embargo. It's what we refer to as extraterritorial. It means that it's not just an inhibition of the inhibiting the trade and economic relationships between the United States and Cuba, but the U.S. policy, the U.S. leverages all of its power to be able to inhibit Cuba's and isolate Cuba to interfere with the import-export relationships with other countries. We can go into how that works, but but these are the things that have to be taken in consideration when we think about the migration and the weaponization of migration and the terrorism that the United States and the U.S. settler colonial state is known for, is a part of it. People may remember when we think about the illegal and unsafe migration, the case of Elian Gonzalez, and I think it was in like 2003, 2004, maybe something like that. I'm not remembering the exact year, but it was around that time where Elian Gonzalez and his mother took him from there and got on one of these rafts. And unfortunately, it was unsafe, and a lot of the people perished. And Elian Gonzalez, who was only 6 years old at the time, was rescued from that, and that brought into Miami with whoever else was rescued. And there were family members there that were of on the mother's side. Now, and they made a big case out of it, and made it, the Cuban exiles and right wing in Miami did a whole lot of propaganda around this thing, around this case. But what, unbeknownst to people, what became they were just saying, oh, all the children in Cuba, none of them belong to the parents, and just kind of absurd, wild accusations. But Elian Gonzalez's father was was alive and was not an enemy or anti-Cuban a counter-revolutionary or anything. And then he wanted his son back. So that became this very huge international case that I don't think the United States expected it, or even the Cuban exiles expected it to go the way they did. It exposed the obscene nature of that element in Miami, and it also forced the United States to have to acknowledge and return Elian Gonzalez to Cuba. And his father came here and retrieved him. Actually, a friend of mine was one of his lawyers. Jose Pertiera was one of the lawyers for Elian Gonzalez's father. And now Elian Gonzalez is actually a grown person and quite the revolutionary there. Now, one thing that I wanted to raise, and this is also exposes the hypocrisy of the United States, and a lot of people just don't know about it, is a 1994 memo. This memo was a memo from Joseph Sullivan, who was the former head of the U.S. intersection in Havana. Intersection is like these in absence of an embassy, because there's no formal diplomatic relations, they have interest sections. And here in Washington, D.C., we used to have that. It used to be the Cuban interest section instead. And that, and now they're, formalized, brought back international, opened up into diplomatic relations. So now they're embassies now. But in U.S. in Cuba, the U.S. intersection operated in a way to try to overthrow and interfere with the dynamics of the Cuban Revolution. In this memo from Joseph Sullivan to former Secretary of State Warren Christopher, and the Central Intelligence Agency and the Immigration and Naturalization Services talked about how they were having problems manipulating the qualifications or manipulating or loosening or manipulating the qualifications of those who fell into the category of political refugees and political asylum seekers. Most of them only fell into the category of economic asylum seekers, and that they kept trying to do this on purpose and were having problems. They're admitting this in the memo. They're saying how they're having problems, and that most people, and that some of the Cubans are coming, they're trying to hustle the system, and they could see clearly that they weren't really political refugees or political asylum seekers. But despite manipulating and changing the qualifications, they weren't getting enough people to qualify as political refugees and asylum seekers. They needed this to buttress their thing about sanctions. I mean, their thing about human rights conditions. Now, a lot of us know that Cuba, sends and their medical missions around the world. I think Jean-Pierre talked about that, and the fact that they try to malign the medical missions as human trafficking, which is something completely absurd. And they can't really face and deal with the fact that Cuba, island, I guess relatively small compared to the United States, and resource strapped, still sends doctors around the world and selfless medical missions, while the United States only does sanctions and military invasions and proxy wars. And so this is something that also it shows how the United States manipulates the immigration and other kinds of things as propaganda and as weaponization. And so now we're seeing that the right wings, a lot of these counter-revolutionaries that pose and accept U.S. policy and do U.S. policy to serve as so-called independent journalists or whatever, and in return for migration to the United States. Now they're having problems because of the Trump administration's new policies that change things for them. And some are even getting letters to say you got to go back to Cuba. I didn't say a lot about gentrification, which is also a migration issue and a displacement issue that affects all of the United States, but definitely in Washington, D.C. In Washington, D.C., and I'll wrap up here, that, D.C. policy used to be what it called a sanction, when we heard of sanctuary cities. But now the Trump administration has put in a law, enforced a law that forces the the DC government to comply with their immigration policies. And then the DC government is in full compliance, not just with these policies, but a whole lot of other policies. The Trump administration signed an executive order not too long ago, creating a safe and beautiful task force for Washington, D.C., which is really just an expansion of federal law enforcement in the city, and introducing things like pretrial detention, aggressive encampment clearances, and increased immigration raids that expediting. And also, this is interesting, part of it is expediting licensing for concealed carrying weapons. And so really it's basically kind of deputizing people and getting people to serve as an extension of the occupying forces, which are the police in the city. So that's that's what we got to do. I think we got to resist things like the blockade, and we have to, despite the travel restrictions to Cuba, we should go to Cuba and build these international relationships. And then we also have to organize our people on the ground for self-determination, decolonization that takes a form of what we in PACA call the first step is community control, as a prelude to a more mass, extensive, built out revolutionary process. So thank you. That's what
Yeah, thank you, Nefa. And thanks to all the panelists for all that you shared there. So one of the, we're going to jump right into the Q&A, and we've got 4 questions in there. If you have another one, please put it in there, and we'll see, you know, how many we can get addressed. Maybe a couple can get put together if need be. So the first question really is going to go to Abraham, who's got to leave a little bit early. And just ask, you know, the issues that you raised, you know, thanks for all the history and the context that you gave us. What are the steps that, you know, that the Black Alliance for Just Immigration suggests that we do here in the U.S.? What do you all think needs to be done here?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think that, you know, it starts with the family, right? Making sure that there's a bit of a defense here, right? Just making sure that family members are okay, making sure that people in the community are also very well aware right now with the raids that are going on, right? It's to interrogate, sort of question that if you see a law enforcement agent or whatever, to really start to say, okay, like, is this ICE, is this the ATF, or is this DEA? And to really understand that we have the right to know our rights. We have the right to exercise it, right? We have our right to also understand that we want to keep our communities very safe, right? And we do that by our Know Your Rights presentation, letting people understand that we don't necessarily, right, have to take the raids that are happening in our community in the ways that they are, right? And so that's a bit of the defense that people just understand that being here without papers is not a crime, right? And also, which is the second part, is understand sort of the narrative that is being put out there, right? And we see this with like even independent journalists, this narrative of they're not all criminals, right? This narrative of saying, well, only this percentage of them had any contact with the criminal system. What that does is that it undoes the decades work that folks in the criminal justice reform movement have basically been calling the criminal legal system, the new Jim Crow, have basically gave it the mass incarceration. So to actually just continue the push, right, and that narrative by basically indicting the systems and the structures that basically say we're going to create monsters, and that's what they're doing. A great example of this is sort of the Lake and Riley Act, which was the first quote unquote law that Trump had signed. And basically what it does is that it criminalizes people. So I would say that the second part is really just to understand that there's a narrative out there that is meant to instill fear in the community. And what that fear does is that it paralyzes us. And so again, know your rights, exercise your rights, right? It is pretty fascist out there, I get it, right? But we can all get together, right, and be able to hold the ground. Secondly, be careful around these narratives that basically push this idea, right, that there is criminals running among us and that these are bad people and these are good immigrants. That narrative is only going to balloon our prison system. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for helping us to make that connection between the mass incarceration and the situation with the migration. So our next is going to go to Katia. And the question is, what does organizing look like in the Dominican Republic against the anti-Haitian, anti-migrant policies of the government? And I guess I'll just add with that, how can we pressure the Dominican Republic's white supremacist government to recognize the country's African identity? So that's 2 questions there. If Katia could come on and.
Just I think we lost contact.
Oh, did we? Okay. Okay, great. Well, then I'm gonna this next question, not great, but okay, now I understand. So then this next question will go to Genevieve. Do you believe Panama will be experiencing some of the horrors that the U.S. inflicted in the 1990s?
Um, so I think as I mentioned earlier, I think things are looking different, right? Because the strategy is different, right? So the strategy is to desensitize people. The strategy is to make agreements, to pre-announce that a possible invasion is going to happen. But the way to prevent it is selling off all these different rights that we have as a country, right? And those things are happening, they're in place. On the other, parallel to that, it's really important for us to know that the impacts of the atrocities that happened during the U.S. Panama invasion in 1990, um, Black people are still living through, right? So that hasn't really changed as much. The community that was first bombed is still deteriorated and abandoned by the country. It's also really important, we try to are very critical, right? Because the benefits of the Panama Canal gets to the country itself, it doesn't get trickled down to the Black communities. It doesn't get trickled down to Black organizations. It doesn't get trickled down to the average poor person that has to feed their family. The benefits from the Panama Canal, the financial ones, go to the government, and it goes to the people that have the concessions, the people that have all these different agreements, right? So are we going to see the atrocities? We have to define what those atrocities are, because housing insecurity is still there. Violence against Black people is still there. Militarization, and not what people understand as militarization, but police brutality still happens in our communities, right? The extreme arm control from security, because not only governmental security, but it's also private security. That's still present in our communities. A devastated educational system where most people that live in rural communities, people that even live in the center of the city, but live in a specific community, they don't get access to adequate education, healthcare services yet. So the devastation of the Panama invasion in 1990 is still alive and well. And there's still open cases around the forced disappearances and the killing of people that are still, their bodies are still have not been identified, right? So while the number of people, for example, that the United States assassinated and murdered are still being even up for discussion 35 years after, we can understand that the devastations of 1990 are still being felt, just that the actions might look different now. And I see another question, so I could answer it now. Can someone speak about the movement of African peoples migrating through the Americas, and how are they being? So the organization Afro Resistance, we just finished a delegation of to the border, right? And was specifically to hear and learn more about Black migration. What's happening in regards to Black people migrating, specifically a lot of people from the continent and a lot of people from Haiti. What we are seeing is a void of services, right? So if anti-Blackness happens in society as a whole, anti-Blackness also happens at the different points of migration. So we're not only speaking when they get to a new country, we're speaking during the migration itself as well, during the actual journey. Anti-Blackness is alive and well with the people that are also migrating among Black people and Black families. And that's if you understand the language, right? So we have made denouncements, right, to different governments around the lack of cultural racial and gender and sensitive services that are not being provided through the journey of people, right? Because they're being provided to a limited extent, but then they're not being provided to Black people, right? So you have, for example, in some of the centros de apoyo, which are like, they're not called detention centers, but it's like sites where people can get services and support. You know, they don't service pregnant women, right? But then they assume that there's a lot of fat phobia, right? So they assume that some Black women are pregnant, and no matter if the Black woman is telling them, no, I'm not pregnant, they're not being serviced, even though they know that they're not pregnant because the woman is telling them, I'm not pregnant, right? So those are just an example. And then governmentally, right, anti-Blackness is alive and well. So and that manifests again in the priorities given to the lighter skin, the mestizos, the white folk, and the Black folks are, you know, the same old thing. They're problematic, they're demanding, they're this, they're that. And even us as an organization, we're being met with the same resistance that society is being met, even though we're one of the only organizations doing that work specifically with a human rights framework. We're not a social service organization, right? So it also limits how the government and the international organizations, you know, the IMO, UNICEF, and all those views people that are advocating for rights and not doing social services. So that's something really concrete to keep in mind.
Great, thank you. We have time for one more question. I think this one's going to go to Netfa. This question is, in this era of Black people being told what is and isn't our fight, obviously centering Africans in the US, what does that inevitably mean for us here in the US to overly disconnect our struggles in this climate where everyone is being criminalized? How should the information you all share with us today inform our coordination of organizing around our shared campaigns in our respective neighborhoods, cities, and states?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that we should remember, or actually, if we not just remember, maybe some of us have to accept that the United States is an extension of Western Europe. It's your European supremacist settler colony. It's a system. It's not like it's not, when we think of settler colonialism, it's not like the Pilgrims came and they settled here and it's over. No, it's a system that persists today. And it means that those of us who are subjected to the ravages of this system that includes capitalism and white supremacy and racism and patriarchy in all forms, all of the actual policies that, you know, that mass incarceration, extrajudicial killings by police, gentrification, all that, means that our relationship to this system, we are fundamental and, essentially speaking, a colonized people, just like the rest of the people of the world. So we referred to you've heard the term domestic colony, meaning basically it's just defining the proximity that that those of us who are colonized actually share the same territory or reside on the same territory as the colonizer. That's what it means. And so in other words, colonialism and colonization is not something that's defined by a metropole or mother country, and then there's some people over there somewhere. Now, colonization is a power dynamic. When we recognize that we are a colonized people, then we also must see ourselves, and we have to kind of, in our programs on the ground, have to get our people en masse to see this, that we are not Americans. Malcolm told us that. We victims of this Americanism. Once our people understand that what we're facing here is inherently essentially the exact same oppression that the global South is facing, then we are an extension, or we are a pocket of the global South within the bounds of the settler colonial imperialist system. So any victory that we have is a victory for the rest of the global South, people struggling against capitalism, imperialism, and, you know, all of that. And any victory they have is a victory for us. We shouldn't be fighting for inclusion and acceptance, or, you know, over the settler colonial. That also includes indigenous people, the Native Americans or American Indians, however we define them, are really the people that are, that we should also remember that we don't want to be accomplices in the erasure of this. And so anyway, the answer to the short is that once we understand materially and essentially speaking that we're the same, we are part of the global humanity and conflict with the enemies of humanity, then it makes our programs clearer what we need to be doing. I hope that answers the question.
That's great. Thank you, Nefa. Okay, well, I think that's the time we have for today. I just appreciate all of the I saw some of the activity going on in the chat, the panelists, and just of course, I want to kick it over now to Austin, who's going to close us out. And thanks everybody for coming out today.
Word. Thank you all for attending today. It's great to have folks on. Thank you, Genevieve. Thank you, Netfa. Katia had to run and Abraham had to run as well. But we're really happy to see everyone here. Just want to let people know that they can continue, to follow the work of our teams, our Haiti Americas team, from the Black Alliance for Peace, as well as BAP's other work, obviously on blackallianceforpeace.com. And one of the things that I think was, as Genevieve was talking about, connecting across the Americas and understanding that one of the initiatives that we have put forward that launched on February 21st was the next phase of our Zone of Peace, of our collective Zone of Peace campaign, right? Not just Black Alliance for Peace, but Black Alliance for Peace is one of the organizations that is leading that effort. And so we just launched on February 21st, the US NATO Out of Our Americas Network. And that is a mass-based, people-centered network for organizations and individuals to connect around, expelling the nefarious forces of our region that propagate imperialism, patriarchy, colonialism, climate crisis, and many other forms of oppression. And so the focus of that really is to build people-centered solutions, right? To build connections by our grassroots organizations, from our grassroots organizations, and to fight for popular sovereignty and people-centered human rights, and a right to self-determination. So to combat some of the things that we heard from our wonderful panelists today. So again, thank you, everyone. Check that out. I think they dropped it in the chat, zoneofpeace.org. And we're going to continue these conversations. And I know many folks are at their webinar watch parties today. So please, continue as y'all are there in your local communities as well, in your neighborhoods, and in this work, that touches, as Nefa said, not only global imperialism, but the domestic imperialism or domestic colonialism. It's important that we build that, local and global connection and be organizing at every level. So thank you all, and have a great day, everyone. Hasta la victoria siempre. And no compromise, no retreat.